good evening. You've caught me in the middle of putting my microphone on. Welcome to our second Pints of View. It's great to have you. Don't know who's watching, but we're really pleased to be here, and we've got some mulled wine to warm our hands and to free our conversation as we get into some questions that sometimes we get asked in pubs. Remember them? They were fun. Remember pubs? They were a good one, though. They were. Just a reminder for anybody who didn't tune into our last Pints of View conversation, where this comes from is the fact that after our Sunday evening service, sometimes we would go to the pub, and those of us wearing clerical collars sometimes get asked some interesting conversations in pubs by people who might not come into church, but might just have some things that bug them about Christianity or bother them or bewilder them, or they're frustrated about, or they just want to kind of put their point of view. And we miss those conversations, so we want to try and bring the bar to your living room. Thanks for having us. So we're going to do our very best today to kind of inhabit those questions and remember the sorts of questions we might get asked. But the truth is, the best questions will be asked by those of you who are at home. We're on Facebook Live and we're on YouTube Live. We can see some of the questions and comments that come up. We also have got some folk in church here who are able to come and show us things that we don't see. So we'd love to have questions. And can I just put you at ease that this is the season of goodwill, and we're assuming goodwill. So if you're kind of like, oh, I don't know how to phrase this, it sounds a bit rude, we're going to assume goodwill on the part of every questioner. So don't worry, that is our baseline assumption. I'm Jenny. I'm the Associate Vicar here at All Saints Peckham. Just let my friends here introduce themselves.
I'm Hannah Steele, member of the congregation here at All Saints, and also lecturer in theology at St Mellitus College in London.
And I'm Jonathan Mortimer, also a vicar here at All Saints Peckham.
Great. We thought where we'd start today, and we'll take this conversation wherever we take it, but you could direct the conversation if you've got any questions or challenges as we go along. With Christmas, we've heard some familiar stories, perhaps. We've sung some familiar songs and carols, but what's behind them? If we walked into a pub with a clerical collar on around Christmas, some of the questions we might get asked, or some of the assumptions that people might come with, let me try and get into that mindset, are the nativity stories, the nativity play I've just been to at my children's school. All very well, but did someone just not make it up? Is it not just a nice story for us to tell at a dark old time of year? What's behind it? Now, there's a whole bunch of ways that we could answer that question, but maybe let's just see what our first instinct would be to respond to that. Christmas, what's behind it? Isn't it all just made up? How can I believe the accounts in the Bible? Where would you kind of take that question first of all, Hannah?
Well, great opening question, and happy Christmas, everyone. The nice thing about being a Christian is you get to celebrate Christmas for days and days and days, because we think it goes on for a long time. So,
absolutely.
We're in that spirit of goodwill still, which is nice. I think there's lots of, as you say, there's lots of different ways that you can go about answering the question, and I hope we'll be able to each kind of chip into a few of those approaches. I suppose one thing I'd want to say first of all is even just more sort of basically to ask the question, can we trust the New Testament as a historical document? So we have two accounts of the birth narratives that we celebrate in those nativity plays you might have been to. They're in Matthew's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel, and they're part of the New Testament, this collection of writings that were written in the early centuries of the church. And I guess the question I'd want to say is, how do we even know that we can start to trust those books as historical documents? And one of the ways that scholars judge the sort of truthfulness or the reliability, if you like, of historical texts is through what we call manuscript evidence. Mm-hmm. So looking at how many surviving manuscripts do we have of historical texts? And they ask two questions. They say, how many copies of them have we got? And how close are they to the events that they're writing about? So I'll give you an example. I guess if we looked at the writings of, say, Plato, that we generally trust is a reliable account of what Plato wrote and thought about and teach it in universities and schools. Now, with the case of Plato's writing, we have 10 surviving copies of his works, and they are about 1,400 years after the time Plato was actually writing. Mm-hmm. And we consider those to be, you know, fairly reliable documents, and we trust them and read them. Now, when you come to the New Testament, the evidence is actually quite overwhelming in terms of the number of manuscripts that we have, and also how close they are to the times they're writing about. So we have about 5,000 surviving manuscripts of the New Testament that range from about 30 to 50 years after the events they're writing for. So actually, most scholars, you know, tend to trust that actually the New Testament is a reliable historical document. Now, the question of whether what those stories write actually happened is perhaps what we're going to discuss. And obviously, that's where different people have different theories and different opinions. But in terms of, can we trust that what we read in our Bibles today, in the second half of our Bibles in the New Testament, is a reliable record of what those early writers believed happened and intended to write, then I think we can begin our conversation in the pub by saying we're on fairly sure footing to say, let's go back to the Gospel of Matthew and to the Gospel of Luke and have a conversation about what it says. And we can do that without that being an intellectually foolish thing to do. I've probably said more than enough to get us started on that one.
Yeah, go on, Jonathan.
And Hannah, one thing that encourages me as a Christian in my Christian faith is to read stuff that are from science manuals or archaeologists, for example. And the more science digs into Christianity, the more seems to be unearthed, in the case of archaeology, literally unearthed, that gives evidence backing up what, for example, Luke, the writer, who claims to be a historian, a credible historian, there's a lot of evidence for his history about the early church, for example, in the book of Acts he wrote, all over the Mediterranean and the countries there, of what he's writing is actually true. So that gives me confidence that especially as a Christian, but actually, whether I was a Christian or not, it gives me confidence in the credibility of what he's writing.
Yeah, I think just to highlight what you said again, Hannah, that I would want to say that what we see in a typical primary nativity play is one thing, and it's probably a bit of an amalgam of some biblical tradition from the Gospel of Luke and some from the Gospel of Matthew, and probably a little bit of poetic license that a primary school teacher has used to give everyone a part. So I think I would want to start the conversation in the pub by saying, okay, what is it specifically that we're talking about? Like there's an account of Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Luke, and there's an account in the Gospel of Matthew, and they're both really rich with information and ideas and sources, and they're different. They come from kind of complementary points of view, but we don't have to believe like the school nativity play, because it probably isn't. We're probably not asked to believe of it. We've got a couple of people watching. Let's have a look. I'm going to just read these out so that we can see where this conversation takes us. What's the Anglican attitude to the other Abrahamic faiths? Oh, interesting. Are they simply wrong or just different ways of conceiving and worshipping the same God? Thanks, John, for that question. And Emma, if the nativity is such an important part of Jesus' story, why is it only reported in 2 of the Gospels when the resurrection is described in all of them? Brilliant questions. Can I just start with Emma's question and say a bit about these two nativity accounts, because I could geek out about this for a while. I'll hold myself back. But so Luke, as you said, he describes himself at the beginning of his gospel as somebody who's put serious work into researching the traditions, researching the eyewitness accounts that he's heard of the life of Jesus. So he presents himself as being somebody who has put some time into researching this. He says there's lots of accounts circulating of this guy, Jesus. I've done some research so that you can be confident, you the reader can be confident. one of the books that I've read fairly recently, which I find a really encouraging backup to Luke's claim, is a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by a man who's done lots of research into how we can see the eyewitnesses' accounts coming through the Gospels. So, for example, the Gospel of Luke will name specific people at certain points where it doesn't make any narrative sense for that person to be named. And the assumption that is made is that he's naming these people because they are known in the community in which this text arrived. And he's saying, this person is involved in the construction of this story. The reason why I say that, to talk about the nativity accounts, is that it seems that Mary, the mother of Jesus, may well have been one of Luke's sources, one of the people that he spoke to or had access to. And so we see these two complementary accounts in Luke and Matthew. And Luke, it seems, the point of view is the point of view of Mary, very much. Matthew's point of view is more that of Joseph. So they're kind of complementary because their sources are a bit different. That hasn't answered Emma's questions. I'm going to come on to that. Why is the nativity account in two different stories if it's such an important part of Jesus' story? Well, to be honest, I do think the nativity says important things about Jesus, says important things about God, but actually his birth was a birth of a Palestinian young boy. There were lots of Palestinian young boys born that year. It wasn't necessarily recorded in ways which it didn't have birth records in the same way that we have today. It didn't have photographs of Mary, in the maternity unit. It didn't have those kind of things that we would capture at the moment of birth, because there was kind of an ordinariness about it, alongside the extraordinary things of the angels and the shepherds, that meant that actually the later events of Jesus' life, there's more evidence about them because he was gathering a community around him to collect his teachings and his stories. He was making more of an impact on communities. The impact of a birth actually is, unless you're the parent, it is not so enormous. So I think probably one of the reasons there are only two nativity accounts is that Jesus started making an impact as he grew up and started to teach and started to heal. The impact of his death and resurrection is world-changing in a way that a birth, before he started to do that stuff, it just wasn't recorded in the same way.
And if you've got four journalists writing about the same story, they've each got their own angle, they've each got their own sources. And while Matthew, Mark, Luke and John are not journalists, they are writing a report of Jesus' life from different angles with different aims and definitely with different sources. John talking about this significance behind the nativity without describing the events, which Luke and Matthew do, and from their own particular angles.
Yeah.
I think it's also worth saying that when we're thinking about, we think about historical events 2,000 years ago, and there's not many historical events of that period of time where we have multiple sources writing about them. Yeah. And we believe many things that happened in history and in ancient history on the basis of maybe one account. So actually to have two accounts that are writing about the birth of Jesus and synthesized in a really nice way, in that they're kind of essentially saying the same thing, but actually they have that ring of truth, that element of, maybe even a couple of details that don't quite match up, or a couple of details that show different emphases. Yeah. I think actually all, to me, adds to this ring of truth. And I suppose something else I notice in the birth narratives, because what we're talking about essentially is really unusual events happening. Yes. We're talking about angels in the sky and virgin births. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a moment. And, miraculous events. And the fact is, when you read those accounts, they're often not believed.
Yes. I think that's really key. Yeah.
Often in myths, something fantastical happens, a rainbow-coloured unicorn or whatever appears, and it's just naturally accepted as part of the story. But actually, when you get to the virgin birth, you have Joseph going, hang on, what? I'm not very sure about this. How can this be? And even Mary herself. There's this element of unbelief at points in the story, which, to me, again, is part of this internal coherence of the narrative
Yeah.
of those events.
Yeah, I think there's a verse in Luke's Gospel which I always really like, which said, Mary took all these things and pondered them in her heart. And I think I can really recognise that some of these things that about this extraordinary birth that came to be recognised later on as significant, at the time, as you say, weren't necessarily recorded by lots of, the shepherds may well not have been literate, so they weren't all writing down, this is what happened when the angels came to us. When they told other people, not everybody was writing down an extraordinary birth has just taken place, because this was so extraordinary that they didn't know what to do with it. Mary took all these things and pondered them in her heart, and it took some time, it took the passage of Jesus' life for her to recognise the significance of things that had happened. It took the skillful work of a historian like Luke to weave together her account with other accounts and other traditions from the Christian community, to bring out the truths of this account, which at the time was was an event happening after an event, and people not having the space to kind of reflect on them. I think you alluded earlier on, Hannah, to the fact of when these accounts were written, how far they were separated. And I always think it's really helpful to share the fact that sometimes we might think that the Gospels were written hundreds of years after the birth and the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. Luke's Gospel was. Scholars differ, they always differ. Well, you work in a theological college, you know that scholars always differ.
Makes it a fun place to be, Jenny.
Yeah, but there's a certain amount of scholarly consensus around sometime in the 60s AD, Luke's Gospel is likely to have been written, Matthew's Gospel is likely to have been written a little bit after that. And both of them draw on sources that came from decades previous to that. So that's what, 30 years or so, 30, 40 years after Jesus' death and the events of his crucifixion. If we think back to what was happening 30 years ago, 80s, 90s, if we read a book reflecting on the event of the late 80s and early 90s, I don't think we'd think of that as scandalously speculative. We'd think of it as fair history, somebody with a grasp that could be checked against eyewitnesses of the time.
And what you had in the first century AD was a really strong oral tradition.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I was testing my child this week whether he could learn the poem that he learnt in homeschooling last time round, but unfortunately it seems to have slightly slipped out of his memory. But we don't live in that kind of culture where we only rely on spoken stories, and we rehearse them again and again and we tell them to our children. But that was very much the culture of the first century AD. You see that in the New Testament, Jesus endlessly telling stories, and the stories, get told again and again and again in different places and to different people. And so there was this kind of oral tradition where stories had, it wasn't just someone saying, oh, what happened 40, 50 years ago? Actually, they're just writing down the stories that they've consistently been telling as part of their community over that period of time.
Yeah.
And another element to add to the ring of truth, to my mind, is that if you were inventing the nativity story, there are bits of it you definitely miss out, of which one in Luke's Gospel is the, I guess it's a genocide, this killing spree by the king. So you're talking about God coming to earth, but he's at the mercy, or rather the lack of mercy, of the king of the time. This doesn't get mentioned in nativity stories, but it's in Luke's telling of it. And Jesus, Joseph, and Mary then become effectively refugees. They go to Egypt, which is fulfilling an Old Testament prophet. But this is who the God is that Luke is telling us about. He's on the run, basically, and he's a wanted child, practically from the day of his birth.
Yeah. Matthew's Gospel, that one.
It is, isn't it? You're right.
Yeah.
And I think it's really good to do what you say, Jenny, of sort of distinguish the kind of the accounts we have in the Gospel from the nativity play. Like, I hate to break it to you, but there isn't an innkeeper in the Gospels. As cute as it is to, I know you're shocked, aren't you? As cute as it is to kind of knock on the door and say there's no room at the inn, actually, that isn't in the Bible. That's part of just the tradition that we've kind of added into the story. It's most likely Joseph went to, his family home in some house, and it was crammed full of people because they were all in Bethlehem, and he was probably in either a back room or a room with the animals, or some scholars say maybe even in like the main family room where the animals were. you know, actually there's some of the details that we've created into the nativity story that give it this sort of sentimental air that makes it sometimes seem a little bit magical.
Yes, yes.
And actually, when you get down to the details, you know, it's good to do that, to kind of sift between the fact and the fiction.
Absolutely. And I mean, I was thinking that when, you know, if I were to be asked in a pub, you know, what it's all just made up, isn't it? I want to start with kind of, you know, what is it that you think is made up? Is it the very existence of Jesus? Is it the life of Jesus? Do you, if it's that, like if he lived, then he was born. Then we can assume that. I'm no scientist, but that much I can tell you. And actually, the life of Jesus is one of the most widely verified historical. I don't. There's serious historians don't question that a man called Jesus lived 2,000 roughly years ago, and that he died, that he was crucified. That's within the New Testament, but also a number of other historical sources, including those hostile to the religion of Christianity.
Yeah.
So I think to discount the fact that Jesus was born would be a very... I don't think serious historians wouldn't dispute the fact that Jesus was born. Then you get onto some of these particular elements around what's claimed by the gospel writers about his birth. Tell me, let's go back to John's question, shall we? What's the Anglican attitude to the other Abrahamic faiths? Are they simply wrong, or are they just different ways of conceiving and worshipping the same God? Who wants to tackle that? It potentially takes us a bit away from the nativity story, but we can probably weave it in.
Well, John, speaking personally, I couldn't tell you the Anglican attitude because you'd get a broad range. There's three of us here. It wouldn't necessarily be covering the whole spectrum of the Anglican attitude. Certainly, take Judaism. It is so important to understand, for me personally, more of the life, the culture of the whole nation into which Jesus is born, and how Judaism and many Jews of the time responded to it. And so many of Jesus' things that he is saying, and indeed Matthew in his gospel is saying, particularly to a Jewish readership and audience, are key for us to understand and enrich our understanding of Jesus. I remember doing this conversation with both of you whenever we did it a few weeks back, and we said Jesus is where the Christian faith comes together, and it's where different faiths divide. And I guess the understanding of who Jesus is with other Abrahamic faiths, that would be true for them again. For us, he is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, the one who was promised and who the angel says to be a savior and indeed Messiah. Jews would not agree with that.
And I think it's important we affirm what we can share in common with people of other faiths, particularly when you talk about Abrahamic faiths. We're talking about monotheism, we're talking about a shared commitment to the concept of there being one God, and this God being the creator, and God being the maker of all that is in the world. And, you know, so there's things that we can, you know, really hold on to that we hold in common. And I've always said, I think I said this last time, that, you know, it's so important we work in partnership with those of other faiths, because we all believe in, you know, the common good, in working within society together for the good of one another and for the good of those around us. So it's really important that we do that, and a crucial part of enabling us to do that is that we do listen to one another and seek to understand one another. But actually to suggest that, as you sometimes hear, you know, all faiths, aren't they essentially the same? Isn't it all kind of, they're all just different paths to the one true God. But actually I think that perspective doesn't do justice to the differences in the different religions. It doesn't do justice to what the Muslim believes about salvation or about prayer or about their life. It doesn't do justice to who Christians believe Jesus is, and the claims that he makes, the virgin birth that we'll probably come on to in a moment, the resurrection. You know, Emma's question, why, you know, do all the Gospels, you know, write about the resurrection? Because actually that is the birth is important, but the resurrection is the pinnacle point of the Christian faith, to say that Jesus was God and he rose again from the dead and offers new life in his name. That's the absolute kind of heartbeat of the Christian faith. And so a perspective that says, well, it doesn't essentially really matter whether you believe Jesus rose from the dead, actually just doesn't do justice to the Christian faith in the same way that perspective doesn't do justice to the faiths of others. But we must listen and understand better.
Absolutely, yeah. And my experience is by listening, we recognise both the commonality, and we learn to respect the differences between our faiths. I mean, the Muslim faith does hold Jesus to be a prophet, does hold him in high regard, and you know, Christians hold him as the Son of God, and those two are respectful but different points of view. And yeah, I think that would be something that Muslims would say the same, that we can be good friends and have good conversations about this. But essentially, there is a difference about this. Yeah.
Jesus once asks the founder of the Christian church, the one on whom he said he was going to build the church, Simon Peter, and he asked the key question, I think, who do you say I am? There's those who people say I am. Who do you, Simon Peter, say I am? And that is a key question. And for us, and Simon Peter came to realize, not least through the resurrected Jesus that backs up everything he said and everything he did. That is why you're right, Hannah. It is the pinnacle. The key to understanding that Jesus is not only for the Christian church a prophet, a good man, a teacher. He is who he claimed to be, the Son of God.
Coming back a little bit to the nativity narratives, but linking in hopefully with a little bit of what we're talking about here. But one of the key distinctives about Matthew's gospel, and which tells us from Luke brings us the angels and the shepherds and brings us the Mary's perspective. Matthew brings us Joseph's perspective a little bit more, and also brings us the Magi, or the wise men, and brings us as Jonathan said, the flight to Egypt when they have to leave in a hurry because Herod is coming to wipe out the young population of Bethlehem. And one of the interesting things, I don't know if this is interesting to everyone, it's interesting to me about Matthew's account of the Nativity, is how much it is written towards a Jewish audience. He weaves in several quotations from the Hebrew scriptures. So one of the things that we hold in common with the Jewish faith is that what we call an Old Testament is their scripture, is their Hebrew scripture. And Matthew weaves this in to the Nativity story. And one of the things I find interesting about this is that people might say, well, was he just did he make up the events around these texts that he kind of picked out of his scriptures? Now, lots of studies have been done about this, but one of the things that's been found, that there were kind of collections of texts that people would pick up from the scriptural accounts and say, these are a collection of predictions around the Messiah. Here's another collection of predictions around the Messiah. But the particular texts that Matthew chooses in the nativity accounts actually have no kind of, they don't have any history of being collected together before the events of Jesus' birth. There's no kind of tradition of weaving together these quotations. So there's no natural way they would fit together. Matthew didn't pick up a pre-packaged group of predictions and make up a story to surround them. You can see through Matthew's account that he notices where Jesus geographically is. He notices that Jesus goes to Egypt. He notices that he's in Bethlehem. And then in reading the text that he's so familiar with and he loves so much, he recognizes in them, and I love to picture this, he recognizes in them, this that I've been reading all my life, that I love, I've suddenly seen a new relevance in it. And he doesn't pick up a prepackaged selection of predictions. He recognizes in his reading, and he's so excited to share that with his Jewish community that he writes this gospel. And he does a lot of that in the nativity accounts, but throughout the gospel, he's recognizing and pointing out this Messiah who's expected by the Jewish people, we can know him. We can know him as Jesus. I read once that the two testaments come together. The Old Testament describes the Christ, and the New Testament brings the Jesus part of it, describes Jesus. So only together can we recognize Jesus Christ, Jesus the Christ, and he is a Jewish saviour. That was I just love the way that the Old Testament is woven into the New, so I can go on about that for ages. John, thank you for your response here. The key difference is the status of Jesus, which means that the different path through doesn't really work. Yeah, I think that crystallises what we were probably wanting to say. We've mentioned a few times virgin birth, and I can imagine a question at the pub might come something along the lines of, come on, you can't expect us to believe that. Or might say there's something along the lines of, I love, Christianity's nice, people I've met in church, they seem to be nice people. There's a lot going for it, but don't expect me to believe that. Do I have to believe that in order to be a Christian? What would you say about those kind of perspectives around the virgin birth?
Well, if I start from here, that if I trust someone and I get to know quite a lot about them, and they then tell me something really extraordinary, like about themselves, for example, which frankly I'd find very hard to believe. If I was meeting them for the first time and that was their opening gambit to introduce themselves to me, I'd say, well, they're clearly a total nutcase, so nice to meet you, goodbye. When you trust somebody and you trust something they've written, something they've said, and you've experienced their goodness, and they say something extraordinary, miraculous. The virgin birth is miraculous. We can't understand it. We can't prove it. We are invited to believe it. The reason I believe it is because I have experienced that God is a God of miracles. And if I could understand everything about God, somebody said this, I think, he wouldn't be worth worshipping. The virgin birth is a fulfillment of what was foretold. And Jesus is coming as the one foretold, the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. As Carol said, the hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. And this is, through a miraculous working God, it would be surprising if Jesus didn't come unmiraculously into the world. So that's where I'd start off. Yeah. But to prove it or explain it, I can't, but I believe it.
Yeah. Hannah, how might you respond to that?
I think in a similar way to Jonathan. I suppose it comes back to, John, your point about the status of Jesus. Who is Jesus? If we're just talking about, as many people do believe Jesus was, a really good man who gave us these incredible teaching about being at peace with one another and turning the other cheek, and left us this kind of writing to follow of a kind of good way to live, then the virgin birth is not necessary. Yeah. Actually, if we want to say that Jesus is just a good, remarkable teacher, the virgin birth, it doesn't make sense in that account of Jesus. But if, and this is where going further into the Gospels and reading further on in the stories, we start to see someone who walks on water, who calms storms, who seems to have the kind of things that, or seems to do the kind of things that we would expect God to do, be able to stop a huge storm, be able to feed 5,000 people from a small packed lunch, be able to instantly heal the sick, even raise others from the dead, and then be raised from the dead himself. Now we're talking about someone who is claiming to be God and is acting in the kind of way that we would imagine, were such a thing possible, were God to walk on the human earth, that he would do and that we would expect. So then it makes sense that therefore his origin is similarly miraculous. Mm. And again, we have these accounts of Mary responding in shock and awe at kind of what is being foretold and what is happening. And there is this sense of you know, I suppose if Jesus is God, if he is God in human form, walking on the water, if God exists and God can create the whole world out of nothing, then God can create a life in the womb of a young woman 2,000 years ago. So it's one of many miraculous things that I guess we are invited to believe as part of the Christian story. And on their own, gosh, they are quite tricky, some of them.
Yeah.
But actually, when we put them together within that whole narrative and with that whole worldview of understanding, you know, who Jesus is and whether he was who he claimed to be, then it becomes just one part of this story.
Yeah, yeah.
What would you say, Jenny?
Thank you. I think I'd say a couple of things. First, I'd just pick up on what you've just said about the experience, and Jonathan said about the experience, and that actually these were writers. Luke was a doctor, and we see that in the second part of his writings in the New Testament, Acts of the Apostles. So he wasn't writing. He was writing from a perspective of a scientist and a historian. He wasn't just out to make up a story. But his experience was such that actually, for the God that he had met in the Holy Spirit, the God that he had had experience of through seeing people's lives impacted by him, that made sense with a God who would also bring life out of nothing, because he'd seen it in the impact of the resurrection. I'd also say that for a Greek audience, an ancient Greek audience, perhaps the more remarkable thing is that God used a human being to be born. Like for a Greek god, Greek gods were sort of heroic and separate and perfected in their bodies and in their beings, and that was the understanding of kind of deity as separate and remote and inscrutable. So perhaps what was more remarkable or more scandalous was that God did use the womb of a woman, that Jesus had human DNA and human features and human frailty and human vulnerability. To a certain part of Luke's audience, particularly because Luke wrote particularly to a Greek and Gentile, a non-Jewish audience, that would have been the greatest scandal in some ways. Not that he was God born of a virgin. He was that God born of a human, God who had human DNA. That's that half of him. Wouldn't want to separate them out, but that element of Jesus' being was more remarkable. I've got some other things coming up here. John, on the other hand, I think that many Jews would agree with Jesus' view that the most important commandments are Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God and love your neighbour as yourself. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're picking up on there, John, is Jesus' status as a Jewish rabbi and interacting with the Jewish questions of his day. He was asked a question about what the most important questions were in the law, and he was responding as a Jewish rabbi. And many would agree with him. In fact, I think his questioner did say, "Yes, you've spoken well. You've spoken well there."
And one thing Jesus did say is that he hadn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it.
Yes.
That he is not coming as an enemy to the law, but the final culmination of it, ushering in a new era for humanity and the world.
Yeah, yeah. Another question, and maybe this is just looking at the time. Maybe we'll see how long this takes us down another little alleyway. But is around. Here we are in deepest, darkest. We're January now, but at Christmas in December, I think people have actually said to me in the past, Jesus, 25th of December, really? Like, is that really when Jesus was born? Did Christians not just take a pagan festival off the shelf and slap a Christian story on top of it? Do you have any opinions, any views about when Jesus was really born? Was it the 25th of December, 2020 years ago?
Well, I'd be tempted to say, I don't know. And to me, personally, it doesn't matter. Yeah. The historicity, in other words, did this really happen? Yeah. Yes, it did. When it happens, well, I don't know, and it seems like just from reading different things, there's a lot of doubt whether it was 25th of December at a certain time. The key thing is, did this happen or not? So I don't know and I don't care.
Fair enough.
I mean, again, it's coming back to what we see in the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't anywhere mention a date, the 25th of December. We don't have that in the Gospel accounts. Yet there is some historical dating around the census and around King Herod. So, you know, we can date it in some senses by kind of measuring it with you know, other historical documents of that time, so we can probably get a rough approximation that, you know, Jesus was born around 2020 years ago, but, you know, might have been earlier than 0 AD in all honesty, or maybe a bit later. You know, there are different perspectives on that. It is most well, some scholars say it's likely that the 25th of December became the chosen date in around the 4th century, with Emperor Constantinius wanting to sort of establish a more kind of sort of official celebration of Christmas and adopting, kind of Christianizing another pagan festival that happened at that time, and sort of putting the Christian sort of festival of Christmas onto that date instead. Other scholars suggest it's like counting back 9 months from, you know, Easter. You know, there are various different perspectives on it. And I'm in your camp on this one, Jonathan, in that, you know, I don't really care. I mean, I love Christmas, and I'm really glad it's in the winter because it's a miserable time and it's a really nice time to have something to celebrate. But my faith doesn't, you know, rest upon the fact of it being the 25th of December, but it does rest upon a baby born about 2,000 years ago who changed the world. That's where my faith lies.
I think one of the sad things about going down these kind of roads is that sometimes some of the Christmas carols we're singing, like, well, like if we go too far down these routes of investigating when exactly he was born, will we ever sing In the Bleak Midwinter ever again? I don't want to take that away from you, Hannah.
No, I love that one.
But yeah, I had to say, I'm kind of in the same position as you guys. I am, it doesn't seem to be, my faith doesn't rest on exactly when he was born. I read this really interesting article about looking at some of the evidence about that we can see in the Gospels, like the shepherds were outside at night. That might give a bit of a, why were they there? Maybe it was lambing season. They were there in a time where the weather was such that was okay. And some other datings around Zechariah and Elizabeth, which are two other characters mentioned at the beginning of Elizabeth's, at the beginning of Luke's account, and the conclusion that he comes to that it was probably in September, maybe, which ties it in rather nicely with the Jewish festival of Tabernacle, Jewish festival of Tabernacles, and John starts his gospel by saying the Word made flesh and tabernacled among us. So that was quite a neat, but my faith doesn't rest on it.
And that's where I quite, and again, I'm going back to Emma's question about, you know, why they don't all have the birth narrative. That's why I love John's Gospel, because John's Gospel is a little bit kind of wacky in places, really, but I love it because it tries to, you know, show the sort of the cosmic significance of Jesus. And it doesn't have a birth narrative, but it does have this wonderful prologue at the beginning of the Gospel saying, in the beginning was the Word, and it talks about the Word being made flesh and the Word dwelling among us. And it's this sense of actually, maybe the details of the story is not the big deal. It is the fact of God being born of a virgin, taking on human flesh, walking out amongst people, offering life in his name. That's the significance of the Christmas story. And so I think we have John to kind of thank for that sort of almost like big kind of picture that overlooks all the sort of historical details of the story.
And I was thinking that as I was sadly taking a funeral of someone, all of us in this church who knew him, loved a lot in the last week. And I was thinking it's not the facts of this person's life as we looked back on his life, and thank God for it, that was really expressing our love for him. It was the significance of this person's life, and what we didn't actually need was all the details. The details were important. The date he was born was clearly important and key, and it happened. But the details of it, we didn't need to hear to express our love, or indeed to have a relationship with him while he was alive.
Yeah.
John talks about the significance of Jesus' life, and does indeed give many facts about it. But nonetheless, it's the bigger picture. Just as we were hearing at this service of Thanksgiving at the funeral I was at.
We've lost signal on our feed for a moment there. So if anyone's coming back on us, we can't see it just for the moment. But I guess just to kind of point to your, to come back to Luke and Matthew, our main sources for Jesus' birth and early years. Because again, I think they're doing the same thing. They're writing as, they're writing as historians, but they're also writing from a perspective. They're writing from a perspective of a belief about who Jesus was. And I think, any historian would say that there is no such thing as an account that doesn't come with with selection and of all the historical facts that can be told about somebody, a writer will choose the facts that illustrate the point that they want to make. And both Matthew and Luke are wanting to convey something about who this Jesus was. Yes, he was born. Yes, this stuff happened. But I think both of them have got something to say about who Jesus was. And I wonder if we might finish off our conversation by maybe both of you have got a bit of a reflection on that. Who did Matthew think Jesus was, and who did Luke think Jesus was, and how do the nativity accounts point to that?
Well, one difference between the two, in all likelihood, and I'm sure theologians differ on this, but the way I see it is Matthew actually knew him. He'd had his life personally changed around by him. So had Luke, but not in the same way. Jesus had once walked past Matthew's called Levi, his workplace, and he'd turned his life around from being a tax collector to being a follower of Jesus, who could use the skills that he had in his former life and that Jesus used in a whole new life, that John calls a new birth. So they're coming from obviously different perspectives, equally informative and authoritative, but nevertheless, that's a key one. That Matthew's speaking about somebody who saved him, who turned him around. Luke has had that experience, but through the Holy Spirit of Jesus.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's hard to pick your favourite gospel. I could never do that. It's like choosing your favourite between your children. Can't do it. But I do love the Gospel of Luke and the account of the birth story, because there's this kind of earnestness to Luke as he's trying to write this historical document and try to kind of, he's very clear about sifting through all the evidence and wanting to present this kind of coherent account. So in one sense, I love it because it's just this clear attempt to really be a historical document, which just gives me such confidence kind of, when I read it. But there's the heart in Luke's gospel that he seeks to bring out is so wonderful. So this emphasis on the shepherds, those who were kind of outside of the main story, and they're the ones that the angels appear to. And you just see this again and again through Luke's gospel. Luke is the one that writes the most about the women. Yeah. And the women, like we said about Mary, feature so strongly in Jesus's, in this account of Jesus's life, according to Luke. I'm sure this is a topic of conversation for another day. I'd love to talk about the role of women in the Bible, because Luke is just so key and showing how utterly transformative the way Jesus was with women. And I just think you see in that birth narrative in Luke this God's heart for those who consider themselves on the margin, those who consider themselves outcast, outside of the mainframe, outside of the city, the ones that are just slogging away, neglected and overlooked, and they become kind of the chief people in the story. And I love what that gospel says about the way God views us and the way God loves us and wants us to take our part in his story.
Great, thank you. Let me wrap up with. I love the Gospel of Luke as well, but I'm just going to put a word in for Matthew.
Good.
We've had a question as to
Oh, great question. Yeah, we can't see the feed anymore, so that came in from the side. Thank you. Before I go down the Matthew route, why is John's Gospel so wacky? Well, great question. Shall I start and then any of you can chip in? So John's Gospel probably was written a couple of decades, decade or so after the others, and so John had some more time to reflect on it. He's more of had a very theological perspective, maybe had a broader range of witnesses and accounts to draw on and sources to draw on, and his theological kind of agenda, well, he says why, that he says why he's writing his gospel. He says, I've written this so that you may believe, and by believing that you may have life in Jesus' name. So he's uncompromising about wanting to present Jesus as who he is, and I always find John's Jesus very uncompromising. I find him quite tricky company sometimes. For me, it's partly about the time to reflect. He's had a bit more time to theologize around who he is. He's writing in a time of quite serious persecution, so I think he just wants to cut to the chase and say, look, we just need to know who this Jesus is. So I'm just going to write this so that believing you may have life in his name. No doubt there's something of personality in them as well. I think there's personality coming through for all of the Gospels, and I think John's personality is part of that.
I perhaps should take this one, having used the word wacky, which on reflection may have been a little rash. And I don't by that mean, therefore, unbelievable in any sense. It's just a very different kind of use of language to the other Gospels. The other Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels because they are similar. They have probably the same kind of historical sources that they're using, whereas John's Gospel, the Johannine Gospel, is different in both its structure and in its approach. And it's actually if you've not read it, do read it. It's actually a beautifully kind of sophisticated theological document, actually, the way the things that Jesus does, the miracles that he does, so the feeding of the 5,000 is then tied to Jesus' teaching of himself as the bread of life. The miracles are called the signs in John's Gospel because John is so clear in wanting to say these aren't just kind of miracles to feed hungry people or to heal people because of their physical need. That's part of it. But actually they're showing us something about who Jesus is. They're showing us that Jesus is the only one who can satisfy our deepest inner needs. They're showing that Jesus is the only one who can be a light in the darkness. They're showing that Jesus is the only one who can offer life in his name. So it's a bold gospel that just makes some very uncompromising claims about who Jesus is and just offers a really different perspective. And that's why it's so good to read them alongside one another.
Yeah, it's a bold gospel written by a bold guy. I mean, he's the only guy. There were a few women. The only guy at the cross. All the other male disciples had done a runner. And he is the one who, in different ways at different times, is closest to Jesus and therefore has these unique insights. This guy who was called, his nickname, Son of Thunder. He was one of the Sons of Thunder, which probably means he did have a pretty short fuse. Once upon a time, Jesus has changed him, but his passion is now, like you say, in this time of persecution for Jesus, and he's fearlessly there at the cross and fearlessly there after the cross. Yeah, I think it's a great kind of complement to the Synoptic Gospels, to the first three Gospels, to kind of give us a kind of a considered theological perspective on who Jesus was. And again, I mean, I actually think that I love the way that John has this encounter between, going back to the women thing, which we could have a whole other conversation about, how John describes the raised Jesus' meeting with Mary Magdalene in the garden. I think is one of the most encouraging texts as a woman, as a follower of Christ who's a woman, and as a minister who's a woman. That chapter of John's Gospel, I think, is extraordinary. I don't know why did he write that and the others didn't. I don't know. One day maybe I'll meet him in heaven and I'll ask. Anyway, let me come back to Matthew and then I'll wrap us up. So I'm going to put a word in for Matthew's Gospel. I do love them all. I think they've all got some great different things to say. One of the things I really like about Matthew's account of the Nativity is it's very unsentimental. I think Christmas can be very sentimentalized in our culture, and I think that leaves some people feeling very left out of Christmas because they feel Christmas is a really difficult time, and it's
they don't feel cozy about it. They don't feel pretty about it. They find it difficult to relate to, you know, a cozy little nativity story with a, you know, family that looks kind of like a nuclear family, and they feel quite excluded from it. And I think we see in Matthew's gospel that there's nothing sentimental about the nativity, about the birth of Jesus, our Saviour. There's nothing sentimental about the way that Matthew describes it. Even the birth itself kind of comes in a sub-clause. I really like this about this. He says, when Joseph woke up, he did what the angel of the Lord had commanded and took Mary home and his wife, but he had no union with her until she gave birth to a son. So it kind of comes in a second half of a sentence, the birth of the Messiah. And then he goes on to describe these complicated people, the Magi, who go the wrong way, find the wrong king, and trigger a cause of events by which just a dreadful massacre happens. The Holy Family have to leave in a hurry. They become refugees. And it's a story of pain and tragedy as much as and difficulty of a strained relationship between Joseph and Mary. It's not a story which is sentimental. I don't think Luke is either, actually. But and I think there's something so important in that Christmas is not a sentimental story. Christmas is a story for the outcasts. It's for the people who have strained family relationships. It's for people who have who feel excluded. It's for people who are refugees, either in a literal sense or who feel kind of exiled from the culture as they see it, who feel exiled from Christmas as we do it, frankly, in the 21st century. This is the birth of Jesus. It's unsentimental, it's transformative, and it comes at this with this amazing joy at the center of it. In all the complication, in all the mess of the Magi coming to meet Jesus, they come away from that encounter with joy. They were overjoyed because they met Jesus. That's the central emotional core of this moment, which is surrounded by complication and difficulty. And isn't that the gospel message for 2020? Yeah. That in the middle of the complication, there is joy in encounter with Jesus. That, I reckon, is where we'll wrap up our conversation. Thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for your questions. We can't now see your responses, so if you're adding any extra ones, thanks for them. We're going to be back next week. We haven't totally figured out what we're going to do or exactly who we're going to be here, but we want to continue to have these conversations which dig into some questions which are challenging about Christianity. So we'd love to hear them from you. You can put them on the chat right now, or you can email us at hello@allsaintspeckham.org.uk. We'll seek some questions some other way, and next week we'll get into other kinds of questions that you might ask vicars at a pub. Thanks for being with us. Have a great evening, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.